O tēnā koutou katoa, welcome to our special Doc Edge event where we're partnering with the US Embassy in New Zealand to commemorate the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Also thanks to Fired Up, Fire and Emergency New Zealand as well. Ko Mike Rihu taku ingoa. I'm a board member, trustee of Doc Edge, and one of their biggest fans certainly are a hardworking team at Doc Edge. And we hope the next 2 hours allow you to reflect, remember, mau maraha, learn and commemorate this day back in 2001, where we saw the horrors inflicted on innocent humans. Where was I? I guess everybody knows where they were. I was in the air flying back to New Zealand from my home in Singapore. When my family and I landed, we digested the shocking news, the pictures and actions of humans driven by extremist views. It really still does make me shudder, quite frankly. But just before we start proceedings and allow people to enter the Zoom room, as we know it takes a while, and welcome if you're just joining us now. Here's the program for the next 2 hours. We do encourage you, by the way, to open your chat box and also your Q&A box so you can ask some questions, make some comments as well. So just looking at the next 2 hours, around, well, just actually in a moment's time, we'll have a mihi and a karakia timatanga from Nathan Hotoroa Gray, then followed by a conversation with the US Acting Ambassador to New Zealand, Kevin Covert, and former Prime Minister Helen Clark. At 12:30, we'll ask you to skip over to the Doc Edge Festival page and watch some films, two great movies, one of them by Amy Schatz, which is almost an educational film, and then also one from Zach Shannon, a local Kiwi young director who created a film back in 2019 about the incident in 2001. Then after that, you're welcome to come back to the Zoom room again, and we're going to have a live panel discussion. Now, in the last 20 minutes, I had an introductory chat with a couple of firefighters from New York, David Morkel and John Buckheit. They're from FDNY in the US. And some of the anecdotes we got just in that 20 minutes was really interesting. And I do encourage you to join us again after the two films at 1:15 and join a panel. Also, Zach Shannon, the filmmaker from New Zealand, will be joining us, and that panel will be moderated by Kevin Covert from the US Embassy here in New Zealand. Around half an hour after that, we'll end our session. And then, of course, at 2 o'clock, free films are available on the festival webpage here on the Doc Edge website for the rest of September. 3 extra films other than the 2 you'll see today. They're Corridor 4, directed by Stephan Trengali. Also, Amy Schatz has another movie. She directed one of the ones you'll see at 12:30. In the Shadow of the Towers, Stuyvesant High on 9/11, and Thomas Haley's movie, The American Dreamer. So lots to look forward to in the next 2 hours. And again, if you've joined our Zoom chat and webinar now, I do welcome you. And it's time now to cross over to Nathan Hotoroa Gray, who'll do a mihi and a karakia for us. Nathan.
Kia ora, Mike. Ka tangiti titi, ka tangiti ka tangi hoki ko tihei mauri ora. Ko te mei tuatai o te mātou atu I Rongarawa, tēnā koe. Ko papatūna ko e te koto nei, kei te mihi. E nā mate ku wehe ki te pō. Haere, haere, haere atu rā. Me nā iwi, kui huhu mai nei, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā koutou katoa. Just before I launch into a official karakia to commemorate this very special and tragic event, I just want to share a quick personal anecdote about one of my connections to the Twin Towers itself. At the end of the 1990s, I was very privileged to have finished my law degree in America and spent quite a bit of time in New York. And being an identical twin, one of my favorite places to visit was the Twin Towers. I'd often stand at the bottom of them both, and just being a sort of young guy from New Zealand, just be so awed at the sheer size of these two giant monoliths, and it was a real privilege just to be there. Upon visiting at these certain occasions, I learned that there was a bar at the very top level of one of the towers, and hearing that it was free to go up and visit, not having much money in those days, as finishing my student days, I eagerly took the lift up. I think it took over a minute. It just seemed to be the longest lift I'd ever been in. And it opened up into this room at the very top with this bar and bistro, and you had a jazz band playing in the corner. There were people of races from all around the world together at all the different tables, conducting business and romantics, and it really was a room filled with heartful wonder. And I remember often going to the main windows of this particular bistro and looking out over the mesmerizing view of Manhattan and waiting for the sun to set. And it just really was one of the great, incredible, probably without a doubt, the most amazing cityscapes in the world. And watching that sunset go over that cityscape as part of the mesmerizing Manhattan experience. And to even comprehend the idea that a plane would have crashed into the building was completely unfathomable at that time, but naturally it did, and we are forced to face this ongoing sort of legacy of lessons and sadness and tragedy that this event has given us. So with that in mind, I'll do a karakia to set off proceedings. Whakataka te hauki te uru, whakataka te hauki te tonga. Kia mā kina kiuta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ana te ata kura, he tio, e hoka, e hau ana. Tihei mauri ora. Thanks, Mike.
Kia ora, Nathan. Ngā mihi. A koe ki te karakia. Hei karakia humare. One of my favourites. Kia ora. So just an apology too to Tony Scotty Scott, who's probably been the most hardworking man in the setup the last 24 hours. I did forget to mention that he'll be joining the panel at 1:15 as well. And feel free to berate me later on that one, Scotty, but that's going to be a great panel at 1:15. But now we're going to join Helen Clark, the ex-Prime Minister of New Zealand, and Kevin Covitt, who is the acting ambassador to New Zealand of the US. Helen and Kevin, thank you very much for joining us on this solemn occasion.
Kia ora.
Thank you.
Helen, start with you. Obviously, you were the Prime Minister at the time. Can you talk us through what happened when the events unfolded in New York?
Well, firstly, let me say it's a very sober anniversary, and our thoughts are with everyone who lost their lives on that tragic, unfathomable, and still incomprehensible day. I was actually on a plane to Europe, and I landed in Hong Kong for the connection, and I was in the VIP lounge. This was before the smartphone, WhatsApp, the rest of it, and there were these very strange and eerie scenes of smoke billowing out of towers in New York. No interpretation at all. I got on the plane and flew on towards Rome, and in Wellington, officials had got out of bed in the early hours of the morning. They held a committee of officials on security and so on, and then said someone had better ring Helen. And I was on the plane, literally sleeping on the way to Rome, and the stewardesses came and got me, and I got a briefing from my head of department. I said, it sounds bad. Let's touch base when I land in Rome. I then made the decision to come back immediately and lead the New Zealand response, because the captain needs to be on the bridge when there are epochal events like this. And it was an epochal event. The first terrorist attack on mainland America, and it had huge implications which play out to this day. So that's my reflection on the immediate reaction.
Kevin, I believe you weren't in the US on that day.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. That's right, Mike. I was serving in Cairo, Egypt. Ironically, the country where the majority of the hijackers were from. And at the moment the first plane hit, we of course didn't have full information. We were scrambling to find out what had happened, and we were sent home immediately as a precaution. And I just remember racing along the Nile, trying to get home, trying to listen to the radio. As former Prime Minister Clark said, there were no smartphones. We really couldn't get real-time, reliable information. Rushing home, making sure that our newborn son was safe, and we sheltered in place for the next 3 days, in fact. And I think what struck me was certainly the disbelief, the shock, and the horror as facts became known. And then watching repeatedly on the television, you know, that endless loop, that reel of the planes flying in, again, trying to process that and trying to make sense of something that was just unbelievable, unfathomable. But I will say this, we ventured out into our neighborhood in Egypt, and not only were we welcomed by our neighbors and friends, but complete strangers embraced us and said, "We are so sorry. You know, we send you our love. We cannot understand how this could have happened." And they themselves were so not just sympathetic, but just in such shock and solidarity with us. And that was comforting. And we saw that play out around the world, of course, how no matter where you were when this happened, we were instantly, all of us, united. And I'm told that the U.S. Embassy here in Wellington was stacked high with flowers for days as people visited to bring flowers and cards and notes and express sympathy. And so it was that outpouring of support from all corners of the earth that I think was very comforting and heartening and affirming.
Given the environment in the region you were living in at the time, even with that love, it must have been like living on the edge because of those embassy attacks further south. Was this completely unexpected, this attack?
And no, it's a great question. I mean, you referenced the attacks in Nairobi and in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and so and of course there had been a previous attack in New York on the World Trade Center, and so I think, look, it's unfair to say that we couldn't have expected something like this, but something of this magnitude, something on this order, it was, I think, again, just simply inconceivable. And certainly the world changed for all of us at that moment, because since that time, we've instituted security procedures. Our embassies, look, unfortunately, I hate to say this, but our embassies are like mini fortresses now. You know, we have setback requirements, we have concrete barriers, we have what we call raptor cages where you drive through, you have your cars screened. All of these precautions we have now necessarily had to take that create distance from between diplomats and the people we're trying to connect to and relate to. That's a necessary precaution that we've had to institute over the last 20 years. So look, I do appreciate the question. It's certainly changed the world and changed how we have to operate.
Helen, you talked, I loved your analogy about Captain on the Bridge. What were your first actions when you got back onto the bridge?
Well, getting back on the bridge, I took a call from Jim Bolger, the former Prime Minister, who was our ambassador to Washington. And I always remember Jim setting out how he was seeing things develop in Washington, D.C. And he conveyed to me, I think, more than any news media report or intelligence briefing could have, the level of hurt and anger in the United States. America was wounded. It was deeply wounded. And how that was going to play out wasn't clear. It reminded me actually very much of President Biden's reaction when this horrible terrorist group, ISIS-K, killed so many people, including American Marines, at Kabul airport in the last 2-3 weeks. You know, America wasn't going to let this rest. So that sort of personal witness, if you like, from Jim Bolger brought home to me that this was going to have quite profound implications, and it did.
And so I guess the invitation to join the war on terror, what was the process like with that? Was there much leverage placed on you as a government from the US?
No, the US didn't place leverage on New Zealand in my time. What it did,
how was the decision?
What it did do was open up possibilities for conversations and relationships with the United States, which hadn't been possible in quite a long time, because we'd been in a position where every time our people ever met, the first thing that was raised was our nuclear-free policy. They didn't like it, we did. Eventually, we found ways of saying we don't need to run into that roadblock the first time we open a conversation. And this was the opportunity for a different conversation, because in a sense, the world's in it together against terrorism. It doesn't matter whether you're US and New Zealand. If you're a citizen of Northeast Nigeria, or if you're a citizen in Somalia, if you're a citizen in any number of afflicted countries today, terrorism impacts on you and your security. And I think that common interest humanity has in human security and being safe from these sorts of threats led us into a different kind of conversation.
Yes, and it's interesting now, where we probably 20 years ago would have thought that seems so distant and far away from us, what happened in New York. But of course, it came to visit us very recently.
Oh, it did. Just in the last week at the countdown in Lynmore. Absolutely shocking that an extremist tried to kill 7 people and would have kept going if there hadn't been a timely police response. We've seen also the sort of opposite extremist reactions, like the mosque murderer in Christchurch, who killed so many people in New Zealand. So we are not immune from the reach of these terrible events. And 9/11 led us to be involved in how things rolled out in Afghanistan, and it's also, a matter of deep sorrow to me to see, around the time of this 20th anniversary, the same people who harbored Al-Qaeda back in power in Afghanistan, and probably at least some 20 foreign terrorist groups of the Al-Qaeda variety able to flourish there under their watch. We need to be concerned, very concerned.
Yeah, when I was researching this interview, and I came upon a poem from a guy called Martin Espada. It's called Alabanza in Praise of the Local 100, Windows of the World restaurant. And I think Nathan alluded to the restaurant there, just an amazing collection of workers who came from around the world, who worked in joy most days, who obviously most of them lost their lives. And the last piece of that poem was really interesting in terms of how it's come back in a circle. I'll just read it. When the war began from Manhattan to Kabul, 2 constellations of smoke rose and drifted to each other, mingling in icy air, and one said with an Afghan tongue, "Teach me to dance, we have no music here." And the other said in a Spanish tongue, "I will teach you, music is all we have." And Kevin, I guess just on the subject, in terms of Afghanistan, have we taken the music away from the people of Afghanistan?
Well, I appreciate that question, Mike. I just want to first pick up that theme that you and Ms. Clark have struck, which is that this was a global act of terror. And if we recollect that people from 90 countries died at the World Trade Center, that was an attack on American soil, but not only an attack on America, right? I mean, that was an attack on people who were living a normal, free, and open life. And it does indeed affect all of us in a very personal and human way. To answer your question on Afghanistan, look, I will be honest and say that this is not how we wanted this story to end. And it's a heartbreaking situation. I don't think anyone looking at the scenes at the airport in Afghanistan, looking at people desperate to leave that country, willing to leave everything they own behind after striving and struggling and hoping for a much better life, would be untouched or unmoved by that. It's painful for me personally to watch, because I have friends and colleagues who were there at the time, who were helping Afghans find refuge and find safe haven. My son just recently became a United States Marine, and he has friends who were actually deployed to Kabul to assist with that refugee and operation. And of course, 13 US service members and dozens of Afghans were killed by a terrorist bomb at the airport, trying to facilitate that evacuation. I will tell you this, though, that's not where the story ends. We're not done with our commitment to the people of Afghanistan. In fact, together with New Zealand, together with partners around the world, we participated in one of the most, I think, complex, massive global airlift operations in human history, bringing 124,000 people to safety just over the past several weeks. And that is inspiring, and that gives me hope.
Thank you, Kevin. Helen, in terms of connection to New York and obviously the time you spent there, have you got any fond memories of New York or any relevant memories that come up over the stay?
Well, like so many people have had the privilege to live and work based in New York, I have visited the site of the World Trade Center, and one of the most moving aspects of that is to go into the church, which goes back to the earliest times of churches being constructed on Manhattan. A very traditional, I think 17th century church, if not early 18th century. And it became a center for the emergency operation, for the firefighters, for police, for others involved in the emergency operation to come and have soup, sit down, reflect. And that church today is still dedicated to that time with exhibitions, relics, if you like, of what had happened. So I found that particularly moving, and I'd really recommend when people go now, there's the newish visitor centre, but visit that church. I think it's extremely meaningful. I did make a visit in early 2002 to New York when I'd been invited to the White House to meet President Bush. And I went to New York, the mayor, Michael Bloomberg, met me at 9/11. The firefighters handed over the tattered remains of the New Zealand flag, which had been found as they got to dig out what had been the flag room at the World Trade Center, and they handed it over. And I brought it home and thought, we must display this flag as a memorial to what happened. And it was framed and hung in the stairwell of our parliament for many years. When I've been in recent years, I haven't seen it, and I really think Parliament should bring out that photo again and put it in a very prominent place, because we need to be reminded.
Kevin, do you have any personal connections with the site itself and in New York?
Thank you, Mike. I completed my university studies at Cornell, which is in central New York, and quite a number of my classmates from New York City. I had several friends who were working in lower Manhattan on 9/11 and were able to find their way to safety, thank God. But that trauma, that experience, that fear has certainly stayed with them and their families and friends to this day. I'm also quite honored to have an uncle who is a firefighter for the FDNY Rescue 3 company. And he answered the call as soon as he heard the news and was just jumped in the car and drove straight to ground zero and spent the next several months assisting with rescue and cleanup operations. So again, I think all of us are affected in a very personal way. And for me, that's just a moment and experience that I'll never forget.
Do you think, Kevin, that the event itself has changed the psyche of the American public?
You know, I've thought about that, Mike. I have to be honest. This is a day and a time of reflection and remembrance. And I would like to think that Americans are just as optimistic and just as hopeful and just as positive as we always have been. I think the world needs that, to be honest. I think we all need to believe in a better future, and we all need to believe in the possibility of something extraordinary, something positive. And I think America has, through its history, its young history, provided that spark and that leadership and that vision that motivates and inspires others. But look, I'll be honest with you, Mike. I think when we were attacked on September 11th, that hurt. That was an attack not only on our cities and our buildings, it was an attack on our psyche, on symbols of America. I mean, the Twin Towers were chosen because they symbolize free enterprise. They symbolize entrepreneurship and opportunity. The Pentagon was chosen because it symbolizes strength and security and projection of positive force. And the US Capitol building was targeted because it symbolizes democracy and pluralism and an open society. Unfortunately, the passengers on the plane that was headed towards the Capitol, the passengers stormed the cockpit and downed that plane and sacrificed themselves in order to save others. But you're right, Mike. Your question really it gets to the heart for me as an American of what was lost that day and how do we recover and demonstrate our resilience and again our optimism and faith in the future.
Excellent. Just coming to last questions, just want to remind the audience that the films are coming up in just a couple of minutes' time. You have to click a link and register for DocEdge to watch those films. So go to the festival.docedge.nz page if you can. And Helen, just wanted to ask you a final question. When you do look back and reflect on those days as the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and as we know, hindsight's a wonderful thing, is there anything that you would do again, that you'd change in terms of what happened over those last 20 years?
No, I always think you make the best decisions you can with the advice you've got and your own judgment and that of your colleagues. And I stand by all the decisions we made in response to 9/11, and also the relationship that enabled us to build with the people of Afghanistan. Just before 9/11, of course, there'd been the terrible event around the Tampa asylum seekers, and we had agreed to accept many of those men, women and children to come to our country, and that's over time led to a sizable Afghan community here who we're supporting as we speak, as they try also to bring out more friends and relatives here. So a lot of consequences from what happened on 9/11 directly for us and for the world.
Thanks, Helen. And Kevin, just in terms of that Taliban takeover, do you think there's a possibility that Afghanistan could be a place where terrorists could launch attacks again? And what's the US's position on that?
Well, look, that was in fact the main reason we entered Afghanistan in the first place, was to prevent that country from becoming a platform or a training ground for attacks on the United States or our partners and friends. And frankly, that was a remarkably successful policy. And unfortunately, we avoided and prevented another attack on the magnitude of 9/11. Look, we will have to continue to press the Taliban to honor that commitment. We are not going to take them at their word on that. But we collectively, the international community, will have to continue to press the Taliban to honor that commitment. You will have seen there was a UN Security Council resolution, and literally 200 countries have signed on to a pledge pressing the Taliban to allow the free movement of people. So look, the international community is going to have to come together and maintain that pressure on the Taliban. We've been able to, I think we still have the capabilities to prevent terrorist activities and terrorist attacks, but we're going to need partners like New Zealand to stand with us shoulder to shoulder on that.
Thank you so much, Kevin Covert, Acting US Ambassador to New Zealand, and Helen Clark, ex-Prime Minister of New Zealand. Really appreciate your time, your thoughts and your comments.